At my husband's farewell dinner, my gold-digging daughter-in-law raised a toast. Time for the old lady to sign over the company. The new CEO is ready. On Monday, I made my final move. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The crystal glasses clinked as my husband's retirement dinner reached its climax. Richard sat beside me, his face gaunt from the treatments, but still smiling as everyone celebrated his 40 years at Hartwell Fine Dining. The restaurant was filled with the aroma of our signature dish, seafood risotto with saffron, a recipe I'd perfected when we opened our first location. "To Richard," called out our son Thomas, raising his glass. "The man who built an empire from a single downtown bistro." I smiled tightly, used to this particular fiction. Richard had been the face of our company for decades. Charming, handsome, perfect for greeting customers and making deals. But it was my recipes, my management, my 16-hour days that built our 15 restaurants across 3 states. And to my beautiful mother-in-law. Indy's voice cut through the applause, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. She stood tall in her designer dress, champagne flute raised. "After all these years of helping out, it's time for the old lady to sign over the company. The new CEO is ready." The room fell silent. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at her perfectly manicured hand on my son's shoulder. Thomas looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict her. Richard's frail fingers tightened around mine under the table. "Indy," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "This isn't the time." "Oh, but it is!" She laughed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Why wait? Monday morning, paper signed, new chapter. Right, Rhonda?" Every eye in the room turned to me. Staff members who'd been with us for decades. Friends who'd watched us struggle to get bank loans when no one believed in a woman's restaurant concept. Family who knew exactly how many nights I'd slept on a cot in our first kitchen. "We'll discuss business matters at the office," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. The conversation awkwardly resumed, but the damage was done. Indy had shown her hand, and I'd seen the cards she was playing. As dessert was served, my award-winning chocolate soufflé, I watched her whisper something to Thomas that made him frown in my direction. Later that night, after we'd returned home and I'd helped Richard with his medication, I sat alone in our kitchen, the room where I'd always felt most powerful. "She's been planning this for months," Richard said, startling me as he shuffled into the room in his robe. He wasn't supposed to be up, but his insomnia had worsened with the cancer treatments. "You should be resting," I said, getting up to make him some herbal tea. "I know what's happening, Rhonda. The doctors gave me 6 months, not dementia." His attempt at humor fell flat between us. "She's been talking to Thomas, filling his head with ideas about modernizing the company, telling him you're too old-fashioned." I placed the mug in front of him, my hand steadier than my heart. "And what does our son say to that?" Richard couldn't meet my eyes. "He loves her, and she's convincing. Convincing enough to make him forget who taught him to make his first roux? Who helped him with his business school applications? Who gave him his first job?" My voice cracked slightly. "I'm so sorry, Rhonda," Richard said, reaching for my hand. "This isn't how I wanted to leave things." I squeezed his fingers, feeling their familiar warmth despite how thin they'd become. "You're not leaving anything yet, and neither am I." That night, as Richard finally slept, I pulled out a leather-bound notebook from the secret compartment in my desk. Inside were recipes, yes, the original versions I'd never shared with anyone, not even our head chefs. But there were also notes, contracts, contingency plans. For 40 years, I'd been the backbone of Hartwell Fine Dining while Richard was its handsome face. I'd prepared for many crises, economic downturns, food safety scares, chef walkouts. I had never prepared for my own daughter-in-law to try to steal my life's work. As I flipped through the pages, memories flooded back. The night we opened our first restaurant with just 4 tables and a dream. The moment we got our first Michelin star, the day Thomas was born, and I interviewed chef candidates from my hospital bed. I had built this empire dish by dish, restaurant by restaurant, and no one, especially not some opportunistic social climber who couldn't tell Béarnaise from Hollandaise, was going to take it from me. I had until Monday. 3 days to save 4 decades of work. 3 days before I was supposed to sign everything over to Indy, who would undoubtedly replace our carefully sourced ingredients with cheaper alternatives, our trained staff with minimum wage workers, our legacy with her vision of quick profits. I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the city lights. Richard and I had met in this city when we were both waiters, dreaming of owning just one small place of our own. Now our restaurants dotted the skyline, each location marked by our signature blue awnings. Time for the old lady to sign over the company, I whispered to myself, mimicking Indy's smug tone. She had no idea who she was dealing with. No idea at all. I still remember the day Thomas brought Indy home 5 years ago. She'd arrived with a bottle of expensive champagne and compliments that seemed to drip from her lips like honey. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've heard so much about your incredible business sense," she'd said, her eyes wide with what I now recognize as calculation rather than admiration. Back then I was flattered. After decades of being overshadowed by Richard's charm, it felt good to be acknowledged. She asked about our expansion plans, our supplier relationships, our profit margins, questions that seemed to show genuine interest in the business side. I'd always managed. "Mom's the real genius behind everything," Thomas had said proudly, his arm around her waist. "Dad makes the deals, but Mom makes sure they're worth making." It was the last time I'd heard my son acknowledge my role so clearly. The morning after Richard's retirement dinner, I found Thomas in our home office reviewing company documents. "Early start?" I asked, setting down a cup of coffee beside him. Made. Exactly how he liked it, with a splash of half and half and no sugar. He barely looked up. "Indy and I are meeting with the bank today. We need to understand the complete financial picture before Monday." "I see." I kept my voice neutral. "And did you think to ask me about those figures? Since I'm the one who's been managing them for 40 years? Thomas finally looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Mom, we both know Dad made the major financial decisions." I almost laughed. Richard couldn't balance a checkbook. He'd signed whatever I put in front of him, trusting me implicitly with the business details while he charmed investors and food critics. "Is that what Indy told you?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. Richard's jaw, but with my stubborn chin. "She's got an MBA from Wharton, Mom. She understands modern business practices." "And I understand our business," I replied, hurt creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. "Look," Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No one's saying you haven't contributed, but you're 58, and restaurant management has changed. Indy has fresh ideas, farm-to-table concepts, social media marketing strategies, streamlined operations." I bit back the words that rushed to my lips. That we'd been sourcing from local farms since before farm-to-table was a buzzword. That our Instagram account had over 200,000 followers. That our operations were streamlined enough to maintain consistent quality across 15 locations. Instead, I simply asked, "And what does your father think about these fresh ideas?" Thomas looked away. "Dad's sick, Mom. He needs to focus on his treatment, not worry about business." I nodded slowly. "I'll let you work," I said, turning to leave. As I reached the door, I added, "Thomas, when was the last time you saw Indy cook anything more complicated than toast?" He frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just curious," I replied, closing the door softly behind me. That afternoon, while Richard napped and Thomas was out with Indy, I slipped into their guest room. I'd never snooped before, had prided myself on respecting my son's privacy even, after he and Indy moved in with us temporarily to help during Richard's treatment. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The room was immaculate, everything in its place. Indy's expensive creams and perfumes lined the dresser, her designer clothes color-coded in the closet. Nothing seemed out of place until I noticed the locked drawer in the desk. Locked drawers had always raised my suspicions. In 40 years of restaurant management, I'd caught 3 bookkeepers and a purchasing manager with locked drawers hiding evidence of theft. I wasn't proud of it, but I knew how to pick a simple desk lock. When you've had to replace as many lost keys to supply closets as I have, you learn a few things. Inside the drawer, I found a leather portfolio containing documents that made my blood run cold. A new business plan for Hartwell Dining Concepts, with Indy listed as CEO and Thomas as COO. The plan outlined closing our underperforming locations, including our original restaurant, which I kept open for sentimental reasons despite its modest profits, replacing our custom-crafted furniture with cheaper alternatives and refreshing our menu to appeal to modern palates. There was also a draft press release announcing my retirement due to health concerns, though I'd never been healthier in my life. The final blow was a printout of an email between Indy and someone named Garrett at Bellworth Restaurant Group, one of our biggest competitors, discussing potential collaboration opportunities post-acquisition. She wasn't just planning to take over our family business. She was planning to sell it. I carefully replaced everything and relocked the drawer, my mind racing. Back in our bedroom, Richard was still sleeping. His breathing labored even in rest. I sat beside him, gently taking his hand. "What would you do?" I whispered, knowing he couldn't hear me. What would the great Richard Hartwell do if someone tried to steal everything we've built? But I already knew the answer. Richard would charm them, smooth things over, avoid confrontation. It had always been his way. It had always fallen to me, to make the hard decisions, to fire the chef who was stealing supplies, to close the location that wasn't working despite everyone's emotional attachment. I was still the same woman who had worked 3 jobs to save enough for our first restaurant. The same woman who'd once faced down a health inspector trying to extort us. The same woman who'd rebuilt after a fire destroyed our second location. As Richard stirred, his eyes fluttering open, I leaned down to kiss his forehead. "Everything okay?" he murmured, his voice raspy from sleep. "Everything's fine," I assured him, the familiar lie we'd told each other through every crisis. "I'm handling it." And I would. Indy had no idea who she was up against. She saw an aging woman ready for retirement, someone easily pushed aside. What she didn't see was the steel beneath my smile, forged through decades of fighting for my place in a male-dominated industry. What she didn't know was that I'd survived far worse threats than an entitled, ambitious daughter-in-law. Monday was coming, and I would be ready. Saturday morning arrived with a sense of urgency I hadn't felt since our first restaurant opening. Richard was having one of his bad days. The chemotherapy had ravaged his body, leaving him too weak to leave the bedroom. I brought him tea and toast, which he barely touched. "Has Thomas said anything to you?" Richard asked, his voice thin as paper. "About the company?" I adjusted his pillows, buying time to choose my words carefully. "He believes I should step aside, that it's time for the next generation to take over." Richard closed his eyes, pain etching lines around his mouth that had nothing to do with his cancer. "This isn't what I wanted, Rhonda. You know that." I squeezed his hand. "I know." A soft knock interrupted us. Indy stood in the doorway, dressed in yoga clothes that probably cost more than our first month's rent at the original restaurant. "There you are," she said with practiced concern. "Thomas was wondering if you had time to go over some paperwork before Monday. Just formalities, really." The condescension in her voice made my teeth clench, but I maintained my composure. "I'll be down shortly." After she left, Richard gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't sign anything, not yet." I nodded, kissing his forehead before heading downstairs. In the dining room, Thomas and Indy had spread documents across the table where our family had shared thousands of meals. The symbolic invasion of this space wasn't lost on me. "Mom," Thomas began without preamble, "we need your signatures on these transfer documents before the meeting Monday." I sat down, taking my time to put on my reading glasses. I thought the purpose of Monday's meeting was to review and sign these documents. Indy smiled tightly. "We thought it would be more efficient to have everything prepared in advance. The lawyers will be there simply to witness and notarize." I picked up the first document, skimming its contents. It was a complete transfer of ownership and management rights, not just to Thomas but to him and Indy as joint owners, with Indy named as CEO. "This isn't what your father and I discussed," I said quietly. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Dad agrees it's time for new leadership." His health has nothing to do with who leads this company," I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. "And since when does your father make unilateral decisions about the business I built?" "You built?" Indy's laugh was like ice cracking. "Mrs. Hartwell, with all due respect, everyone knows Richard was the visionary behind Hartwell Fine Dining." "Is that so?" I removed my glasses slowly. "Tell me, Indy, who created the recipes that won us 3 James Beard Awards? Who managed the books when we couldn't afford an accountant? Who worked out our first supply chain when local farmers wouldn't even talk to a female restaurateur?" Thomas placed his hand over mine. "Mom, no one's diminishing your contribution, but times have changed and the company needs to evolve." "Into what?" I asked, pulling out the business plan I'd found in Indy's drawer. "A sellout to Bellworth Restaurant Group?" The color drained from Indy's face. Thomas looked confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I placed the email printout on the table. "Your wife has been in discussions with our largest competitor about selling our restaurants after your father and I are out of the picture." Thomas stared at the document, then at Indy. "This has to be a misunderstanding." Indy recovered quickly, her smile brittle. "It was just an exploratory conversation. Bellworth reached out to me because of my business background. I was gathering information, that's all." "About selling my life's work without my knowledge?" I kept my voice level, but inside I was seething. Thomas looked torn, exactly as he had as a child when caught between his parents' occasionally differing viewpoints. Except this wasn't about bedtime or homework. This was about everything Richard and I had sacrificed for. "We should discuss this as a family," he finally said. "Yes, we should," I agreed, standing up. "But not today. I need to speak with your father's attorney first." "His attorney?" Indy's voice sharpened. "Why?" I gathered the unsigned documents. "Because, contrary to what you both seem to believe, Richard and I made legal provisions for the succession of this company years ago. Nothing happens until those are reviewed." I left them sitting there, Thomas looking bewildered, Indy's face a mask of barely contained fury. An hour later, I sat in Gerald Preston's office. He'd been our attorney for 30 years, handling everything from lease negotiations to the time a customer tried to sue us over a fabricated food poisoning claim. "I didn't expect to see you until Monday," he said, offering me coffee. "Plans change," I replied, declining the coffee. "Richard's condition is deteriorating faster than expected, and it seems my daughter-in-law is accelerating her own plans." Gerald's expression grew serious. "She's been calling me, asking about the company structure, ownership percentages, Richard's will. I've told her only what's public record." "Good. What about the amendments Richard and I made last year?" Gerald nodded, pulling out a file. "Still in place and legally binding. Richard signed everything with a sound mind, with 2 physicians present, as witnesses due to his illness." Relief washed over me. At least Richard had kept his promise on this. "Does Thomas know?" Gerald asked gently. I shook my head. Richard wanted to tell him together after his retirement, but things moved faster than we anticipated. Gerald handed me a sealed envelope. "Richard left this with me last month. He asked me to give it to you if circumstances changed. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter in Richard's handwriting, shakier than it once had been but still recognizable. My dearest Rhonda, it began. If you're reading this, I wasn't strong enough to stand beside you one last time. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for many things, for taking credit that should have been yours, for being the face of success that you created, for not telling the world the truth, that you are the heart, soul, and brains of everything we built together. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. The letter detailed Richard's wishes for the company, his concerns about Indy's influence over Thomas, and his unequivocal statement that I should retain control until I, not anyone else, decided it was time to step down. The final paragraph hit me hardest. I've made provisions in my will that may surprise Thomas and certainly won't please Indy. Stand firm, my love. One last time, let me publicly acknowledge what should have been said years ago. Hartwell Fine Dining has always been yours. It's time everyone knew it. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my purse. Thank you, Gerald. Will you be ready for Monday? He asked. I stood, straightening my shoulders. I've been ready for 40 years. Richard died on Sunday morning. I was holding his hand, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth as he struggled for each breath. Thomas was there too, his eyes red-rimmed, gripping his father's other hand. Indy stood in the doorway, her expression appropriately somber but her eyes calculating, watching as the man who stood between her and control of our company slipped away. Take care of each other, Richard whispered, his last words barely audible. And the restaurants, our legacy. Then he was gone, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the room whole. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls, and grief that hit me in unexpected waves. Thomas handled most of the notifications, his voice breaking each time he had to say the words, "My father passed away." For all his recent behavior, he truly had loved Richard. The Monday meeting was postponed, of course. No one expected me to discuss business on the day after my husband's death. No one except Indy. We should reschedule for Wednesday, she said as we sat in the funeral home selecting a casket. The quarterly reports are due, and suppliers need direction. Thomas looked appalled. Indy, for God's sake. We just lost Dad. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. I know, honey. But your father would want the business to continue smoothly. It's what Rhonda needs too. Structure, purpose. I said nothing, letting her dig her own grave with every insensitive word. The funeral was on Thursday, a rainy afternoon that matched our mood. Hundreds of people attended, staff from all 15 restaurants, chefs who had trained under us, food critics who had become friends over decades of reviews, customers who felt like family after countless celebrations at our tables. I stood at the front of the church, accepting condolences in a black dress I had worn only once before, when Richard's father died. Thomas stayed by my side, Indy perpetually at his elbow, whispering in his ear every few minutes. That's Leonard Garfield, she murmured during one such moment. Food editor at the Tribune. We should invite him to the new menu tasting next month. I pretended not to hear, but I filed away every calculating comment, every inappropriate business discussion. The real Indy was emerging more clearly with each passing hour, too impatient for even the pretense of mourning. After the service, we hosted a reception at our flagship restaurant. The staff had transformed the space, covering the tables with black cloths and placing photos of Richard throughout his life on every surface. In the center stood a massive ice sculpture of our original storefront, a masterpiece created by our head chef as a tribute to the man everyone believed had built our empire. As I moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and sharing memories, I noticed Indy had cornered Marcel, our executive chef of 15 years. Completely refresh the menu, she was saying, her tone brooking no argument. Something more Instagram-friendly. The classics have had their day. Marcel caught my eye over her shoulder, his expression a mixture of disbelief and alarm. I gave him a subtle nod, a signal we'd used for years when difficult customers needed handling. He understood immediately. "Perhaps we could discuss this after the mourning period, Mrs. Hartwell," he said formally. "Today we honor Richard's legacy." Indy's smile tightened. "Of course. But change is coming, Marcel. Best to embrace it." As she walked away to join Thomas, Marcel approached me. "Madame, what is happening? She speaks as if she already owns Hartwell." I patted his arm reassuringly. "Focus on today's menu, Marcel. I'll handle tomorrow's." By Saturday, the house felt emptier than I could have imagined. Richard's absence was a physical ache, a hollow space where his voice, his laugh, his very presence should have been. I wandered through rooms filled with memories, touching his books, his favorite chair, the collection of vintage corkscrews he'd amassed over the years. In the kitchen, my domain, my sanctuary, I found Thomas sitting, alone at the table, staring at a cup of cold coffee. "Can't sleep?" I asked softly, sitting across from him. He shook his head. "I keep thinking about Dad, about what he would want us to do now." I reached for his hand. He would want us to honor what we built, to protect it. Thomas looked up, his eyes, so like Richard's, searching my face. "Indy says we need to move quickly. That competitors will see Dad's death as an opportunity to poach our staff, our suppliers." "And what do you think?" He hesitated. I think she's been pushing very hard, even before Dad died. And I don't understand why." A small crack in eye, his certainty, a sliver of doubt. "It wasn't much, but it was something." "The meeting has been rescheduled for Monday," I said. "We'll sort everything out then." Thomas nodded, then asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Do you know what's in Dad's will?" I considered my words carefully. "Your father made provisions, for both of us and for the company. He wanted to ensure his legacy was protected." "And Indy? Did he make provisions for her?" I met his gaze steadily. "Thomas, you know your father always believed family businesses should stay in the family." He looked away, a flush creeping up his neck. "She's my wife. That makes her family." "Yes," I agreed. "But she's not a Hartwell. Not by blood, not by years of building this company dish by dish, restaurant by restaurant." Thomas stood abruptly. "You've never given her a chance. From day one, you've treated her like an outsider." "That's not true," I said calmly. "I welcomed her into our home, our family. But the business? That's different. That requires earning a place at the table." "By doing what? Spending 40 years in your shadow, like Dad did?" The words hit like a physical blow. "Is that what you think? That your father lived in my shadow?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Richard that my heart ached. "I don't know what to think anymore. Indy says one thing, you say another. Dad's gone, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about our family, our business, seems complicated." I stood up, reaching for him, but he stepped back. "Get some rest," I said instead. "Monday will be here soon enough." After he left, I went to Richard's study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a small safe, unlocked with a combination only Richard and I knew, our first restaurant street address. I removed a USB drive and a folder of documents he had prepared months ago, when his diagnosis first came. Insurance, he had called it, in case things don't go as planned. I hadn't looked at the contents then, trusting that Richard had handled things as he always did, with meticulous attention to legalities and loopholes. Now, as I connected the drive to my laptop, I realized just how thorough he had been. There were photos, emails, financial records, A complete history of Hartwell fine dining from my perspective. Evidence of every decision I had made, every crisis I had averted, every success I had orchestrated while Richard took the public credit. It was everything I would need on Monday. As I closed the laptop, I caught sight of our wedding photo on Richard's desk. We looked so young, so hopeful, standing in front of that tiny restaurant with the peeling blue paint that would become our signature color. "One last time," I whispered to his image. "One last stand together." Monday morning dawned clear and bright, a jarring contrast to the heaviness in my heart as I prepared for the most important business meeting of my life. I dressed with particular care. A tailored navy suit I'd worn to receive our 3rd Michelin star, pearls Richard had given me on our 30th anniversary, and my grandmother's brooch for luck. As I fastened the brooch, I caught sight of my reflection. The woman staring back at me wasn't the young, uncertain chef who had once begged banks for loans. She was a woman who had built something lasting, something worth fighting for. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. at our corporate office above the flagship restaurant. I arrived early, nodding to Sophia at the reception desk, who had been with us for 20 years. Her eyes were sympathetic. Somehow, the staff always knew when storms were brewing. "They're all here already, Mrs. Hartwell," she whispered. "In the main conference room." "They?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Indy, and—" She hesitated. "Someone from Belworth Restaurant Group, a Mr. Garrett Lawrence." So Indy had brought the competition to our transfer meeting. Bold. Stupid, but bold. "Thank you, Sophia," I said calmly, though my pulse quickened. "Please hold all calls." As I approached the conference room, I heard Indy's voice through the partially open door, "Signed and finalized before lunch. The press release is already drafted, and Garrett's team is prepared to move immediately on the acquisition." "Shouldn't we wait for Mom?" Thomas sounded uncertain. "She'll be here soon. Besides, this is just a formality. The lawyers have the papers ready." I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The conversation stopped abruptly as I entered. Thomas looked guilty, Indy triumphant, and the man I assumed was Garrett, sleek in an expensive suit, calculating. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "I see we have an unexpected guest." Indy's smile was razor-sharp. "Rhonda, this is Garrett Lawrence, Executive Vice President of Acquisitions at Belworth. He's here to discuss some exciting opportunities for Hartwell's future." I set my briefcase on the table. How convenient that he arrived on the very day of our ownership transfer, almost as if it were planned. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we should talk about this." "Yes, we should," I agreed, taking my seat at the head of the table, Richard's usual spot. "But first, let's address the actual purpose of today's meeting." Gerald Preston, our attorney, entered with his assistant, nodding respectfully in my direction. "Mrs. Hartwell, my condolences again for your loss." "Thank you, Gerald. Shall we begin?" Indy leaned forward, all business. "We have the transfer documents prepared. Once signed, Thomas and I will assume full ownership and management control of Hartwell Fine Dining." Gerald cleared his throat. "Actually, before we proceed with any transfers, we need to review the terms of Mr. Hartwell's will, which was updated and finalized 3 months ago." Indy's expression flickered. "The will is a separate matter. We're here about the business." "They're interconnected," Gerald explained, opening his briefcase. "Mr. Hartwell's personal and business assets are part of the same estate planning." I watched Indy's confidence begin to crack. She hadn't anticipated this complication. Gerald removed a document and adjusted his glasses. "I'll summarize the key points. First, Mr. Hartwell's personal assets, the house, investments, and insurance policies, are divided between Mrs. Hartwell and Thomas with specific bequests to longtime employees." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. Indy tapped her fingernails impatiently on the table. "Regarding Hartwell Fine Dining," Gerald continued, Mr. Hartwell made specific provisions. The company remains under the full control of Mrs. Rhonda Hartwell, who has always been the majority shareholder despite public perception. What? Thomas looked stunned. Indy's face drained of color. Furthermore, Gerald went on, Mr. Hartwell stipulated that upon Mrs. Hartwell's retirement, at her discretion, ownership will transfer to Thomas Hartwell alone, provided he has worked in an executive capacity at the company for a minimum of 5 years and has demonstrated a commitment to maintaining the company's founding principles. Indy's voice was shrill. This can't be right. Richard agreed to nothing of the sort, I interrupted, my voice steel beneath silk. My husband and I built this company together, with a vision and standards we both believed in. He would never have handed it over to someone looking to strip it for parts and sell it to our biggest competitor. I turned to Thomas, whose shocked expression told me he truly hadn't known. Your father wanted you to have the company eventually, son. But he wanted you to earn it, to understand it from the inside out, not just take it over because you married someone with an MBA. Thomas looked between me and Indy, confusion and hurt warring on his face. I don't understand. Indy said you and Dad had agreed to the transfer. That it was all arranged. She lied, I said simply. And I suspect that's not the only thing she's been dishonest about. I opened my briefcase and withdrew the folder I'd prepared. These are emails between Mrs. Indy Hartwell and Bellworth, restaurant group dating back 8 months, long before your father's retirement was announced. They outline a plan to acquire our company, strip our recipes and customer base, and rebrand our locations as Bellworth establishments. I slid copies across the table to everyone present. You'll note that Mrs. Hartwell was to receive a significant consulting fee and executive position after the sale. Thomas isn't mentioned once in these discussions. Garrett Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in his watch. This is absurd, Indy sputtered, but her eyes darted nervously to the documents. Is it? I turned to my son. Thomas, do you know that Indy has never completed the executive training program your father required for all family members working in the business? That she's never spent a day in our kitchens learning what makes Hartwell special? That she can't even make our signature seafood risotto, which you mastered at 16? Thomas stared at the emails, his expression hardening as he read. Indy? What is this? She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Tommy, it's not what it looks like. I was gathering information, seeing what options were available. For yourself, he finished, his voice hollow. Not for us. Not for the family legacy. Indy's desperation was palpable. Your mother is manipulating you. She's always been controlling, always had to be in charge. That's enough, I said quietly. Gerald, please continue with the will. Gerald nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding. There is one additional provision. In the event that anyone attempts to circumvent Mrs. Hartwell's authority or seeks to sell company assets without proper authorization, they are to be immediately removed from any position within the company and stripped of any future inheritance rights. Silence fell over the room. Indy's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. Thomas looked devastated, betrayed by the woman he had trusted above his own parents. Garrett Lawrence stood abruptly. I think I should excuse myself from this family discussion. I think that would be wise, I agreed coldly. And Mr. Lawrence? Bellworth should know that Hartwell Fine Dining is not now, nor will it ever be, for sale. After he left, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with one of our chef's knives. What happens now? Thomas finally asked, his voice small. I looked at my son, Richard's eyes, my determination, and currently a heart breaking with betrayal. Now, I said gently, we rebuild. 1 month after what the staff now quietly referred to as the Monday meeting, I sat in my office above the flagship restaurant, reviewing plans for our anniversary celebration. 40 years since Richard and I had opened our first tiny bistro, a milestone he wouldn't see but one I was determined to honor properly. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Thomas entered, looking more like his father than ever in a chef's coat rather than his usual business suit. "The special menu is ready for your approval," he said, placing a folder on my desk. "Marcel and I finalized it this morning." I smiled, opening the folder to find a beautifully curated selection of dishes, our classics reimagined with subtle, respectful updates. Thomas had spent the past month in our kitchens, relearning the fundamentals of what made Hartwell special. It was his form of penance, his way of reconnecting with the legacy he'd nearly lost. "It's perfect," I said, genuinely impressed. "Your father would be proud." Thomas's expression softened. "I'm not sure about that. He trusted me to protect what you both built, and I almost handed it over to someone who would have destroyed it." "We all make mistakes when it comes to love," I replied gently. "The important thing is learning from them." The divorce proceedings had begun 2 weeks after the Monday meeting, once Thomas discovered Indy had been transferring company funds to a personal account, her exit strategy, as she'd labeled it in emails we later found. The betrayal had been complete, devastating in its scope. Thomas had moved back home temporarily, sleeping in his childhood bedroom while he sorted through the wreckage of his marriage. "Have you heard from her?" I asked carefully. Thomas shook his head. "Not since the lawyer's letter. She's contesting everything, of course. Claims she contributed to the company's success." I snorted. "That should be an interesting argument to make in court, given the evidence." "Gerald says it's just posturing. She'll settle eventually." He hesitated. "I saw her yesterday, actually." My eyebrows rose. "Where?" A hint of satisfaction crossed his face. "At the Capitol Grill. She was waiting tables." I tried not to look too pleased. "From almost CEO to server in a month. That's quite an adjustment." "It gets better," Thomas said, leaning forward. "She didn't see me, but I overheard her manager. Apparently, she's been reassigned to dish duty after customers complained about her attitude. The image was almost too perfect. Indy, with her designer clothes and manicured nails, elbow-deep in dirty dishwater. I shouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did, but after everything she'd put my family through, the poetic justice was undeniable." "Well," I said, composing myself, "everyone has to start somewhere in the restaurant business. Though most of us start there because we want to learn, not because we failed at a corporate takeover." Thomas laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him since before Richard's death. The sound warmed me, a reminder that healing was possible, that we would be okay. Later that afternoon, I walked through the dining room as the staff prepared for service. The familiar rhythm of a restaurant coming to life surrounded me. The clink of silverware being polished, the soft murmur of the bartender organizing bottles, the percussive symphony of knives against cutting boards in the kitchen. Marcel emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Madame, the new soufflé is ready for you to taste. Thomas's recipe with a few of my adjustments." I followed him back to the kitchen, where Thomas stood nervously by the pass, watching as a perfect chocolate soufflé was plated. It wasn't just any chocolate soufflé. It was a variation on the dessert that had won us our first critical acclaim, the one Richard had always insisted only I could make properly. "You taught him the secret?" Marcel asked, eyebrows raised. "It was time," I replied simply. Thomas carefully placed the plate before me, the soufflé still rising majestically, a testament to perfect timing and technique. I took a spoon and broke through the delicate crust, releasing a cloud of chocolate-scented steam. The first bite was a revelation. The original recipe, yes, but with subtle notes of cardamom and orange that made it both familiar and new. Tears pricked at my eyes unexpectedly. "It's magnificent," I said, my voice slightly husky. "Your father would have loved it." Thomas exhaled in relief. "Does this mean I pass?" I nodded, too moved for words. In that moment, I knew Richard had been right all along. Thomas was ready, or at least on his way to being ready. Not now, maybe not for several years, but eventually I could trust him with our legacy. That evening, after the last customers had gone and the kitchen was winding down, I found myself alone in Richard's, now my office. The lights of the city twinkled beyond the window, a view we'd dreamed of when we were just two young waiters with ambition. My phone buzzed with a text from our head hostess. Just seated the Camerons at table 5, their 30th anniversary, asked for you specifically. I smiled, remembering the young couple who had celebrated their engagement at our first location 3 decades ago. They'd returned for every significant milestone since, becoming not just customers but friends. This was what Indy had never understood about Hartwell. We weren't just selling meals, we were creating memories, building relationships that spanned generations. As I made my way downstairs to greet the Camerons, I passed the wall of photographs near the entrance. Richard's face smiled from nearly every frame, charming, photogenic, the perfect frontman. In the center was my favorite, Richard and me on opening night, exhausted but ecstatic, standing in front of those 4 little tables that had been the start of everything. I'd added a new photo just that morning, Thomas in his chef's coat, plating, the anniversary menu's signature dish under Marcel's watchful eye, the future of Hartwell, learning as I had learned, earning his place as I had earned mine. In the quiet of the nearly empty restaurant, I raised my glass to Richard's smiling face. We did it, love. We protected what matters. I could almost hear his laugh, feel his hand on my shoulder. No, Rhonda, he would have said. You did it. You always did. Outside in the dining room, the Camerons were waiting to reminisce about old times, to create one more memory within our walls. Tomorrow, Thomas would continue his kitchen training, taking another step toward earning the legacy his father had protected for him. Next week, I would meet with our architects about the renovation of our original location, ensuring it would stand for another 40 years. And somewhere across town, Indy was washing dishes, learning the hard lesson that genuine success can't be manipulated or stolen. It must be built one plate at a time with integrity and love. I straightened my shoulders, smiled, and stepped into the dining room to greet our guests. The show, as Richard always said, must go on, and what a show it would be. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.